I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my inteligente co-host, Brett.
Oh, wow, Alice. Pulling out the Espanol. I see.
Well,
I
have
like
to thank Bonnie for that, and she was so wonderful to send me adjectives, and I think she was going for other languages because you've been searching other languages, and she even wrote out how to pronounce these languages for me. I went with inteligente because it's just so beautiful in Spanish.
It is beautiful. It is beautiful. You did a great job, Alice. Amazing.
I do what I can, but again, as we all know, it's not about you, Brett. It's never about you. But you know what is inteligente? You know what's inteligente?
What?
Especially coming off the heels of CrimeCon, something that's been on our mind a lot, that we've talked about, we've even written about recently in an op-ed on Fox News called The Dark Side of True Crime, is true crime and ethics, and the ethics of true crime, which is something that I know a lot of people have spoken about, a lot of people have complained about. But how I like to think about it is the first step is diagnosing the problem. And I think that goes a long way in trying to understand what all of our roles are in the true crime space, because it is entertainment, it is informative, but it is also real people's lives that we are talking about. And there is ethics in everything that we do, but what does that look like in the true crime space?
And we really want this to be a discussion and something people think about and talk about in all the various places you guys discuss the podcast. This is not about us preaching to you or getting up on our high horse or anything like that. We don't want it to be that at all. Normally, I don't even like these discussions, frankly. They come up a lot in true crime, because a lot of people, for whatever reason, have like a self-hating relationship with true crime. They enjoy it, but they just think true crime is inherently bad. And so they want to criticize it, right? Like, I always give this example. There was an episode where we talked, at the end, we said something like, I hope you enjoyed this episode. We had somebody on YouTube who was like, how could you enjoy an hour discussion about a murder? And it's like, well, why are you listening to it if you didn't enjoy it? Is it just some sort of torture? So when it's that kind of thing, when it's criticizing people for listening to true crime, criticizing people for going to CrimeCon, that kind of stuff, I find that to be not that worthy of discussion. But what we're talking about here is something that I think is much more important, because we're seeing it manifest itself in the real world more and more. And it's how we talk about true crime, how we consume true crime, and the effect it can have on ongoing cases. And you have absolutely seen that. The three that we used in the article we wrote were Delphi, the Idaho case, and the Karen Reed case. And in all of those cases, you have true crime making its way into the actual investigation or into the actual trial, and not in a positive way.
Indeed. So, I mean, here's the thing with any type of ethics, and we talk about this ethics in practicing law, which is actually literal codes of ethics that each bar has adopted. But when we talk about the true crime space, I think this is very important, because whether we believe it or not, if you publish a podcast, if you make documentaries, if you do anything that puts out into the public domain your views on a case, you have a platform. It might be a platform of one, but that platform of one could be a massive difference. And so anyone with a platform, no matter how large or small it is, has a responsibility in the information that they convey, even if they claim it's their opinion, because there are wild opinions based in nothing, rooted in nothing, that can do a lot of damage. And there are also ways of communicating things that adds to the conversation, adds to the discussion in an intelligent manner, and doesn't seek to simply straw man attack those out there who cannot defend themselves. Because that's the thing about these platforms. They're one way. You can always respond to our podcast or a documentary in another format, right? You can do another podcast about our podcast, or you could make a counter documentary. But when someone is watching or listening to your platform, there is no rebuttal from another side. And that's why I think it's incredibly important for you to be able to convey information responsibly, because you have to assume the people who are listening to you may not seek out or may not be able to access another point of view in that area.
And since we're in legal briefs, we can make this nerdy. We've talked about grand jury before. And when you're a prosecutor and you walk into grand jury, obviously you are seeking an indictment. You're trying to have someone indicted. You're trying to have them arrested, which will lead to a trial that could put them in prison for many years. But you're the only voice there. And you have an obligation, ethical obligation, if there is material evidence pointing the other way, to raise it, not to hide it, not to ignore it, but to bring it to the people that you're trying to convince of your position so that they have both sides, so that they can consider both sides. And I think one of the problems you see more and more, and there's a spectrum here, and I think these three cases are actually a really good example of that spectrum. But I think one thing you see more and more is this, it's not just black and white, but it's like as black or as white as it could be. I mean, what you're seeing more and more in true crime is this presentation of, it is so obvious that one side is right, that the other side must be disingenuous, they must be lying, they must be corrupt, they must be part of the conspiracy, they must be bad people. You're seeing that more and more. That is a problem across our country and our society right now, frankly, but you're really seeing it manifest itself in true crime. And we've seen that. We talked about the Karen Reed case. The Karen Reed case has become a really great example of that, because whatever you think happened in that case, whatever you think the truth is there, that's not what this is about. It's not about which side you think's right or wrong. It's not about that. It's about the way people approach it. And what you've seen in that case is people who became so ingrained in the idea that Karen Reed is not only innocent, but is being framed, and is being framed by a lot of different people, that they began to target those people outside of court, outside of an investigation, in real life, to the extent that one person involved in this has now been charged with, I think, 16 counts of harassment and witness intimidation. That should never happen. It is not conducive to justice. It doesn't help you to get to truth. And frankly, it's not your job to do that.
And while that's an extreme example of witness intimidation, where someone actually gets charged with those crimes, remember, we've actually talked about this a lot. Years past. This is not something that is new. We talked about before there was an arrest in the Delphi case. We covered this case well before, Richard Allen was on any of our radars. We talked about the harm it was doing to have people on Facebook comparing pictures of real people who they didn't know. They would just pull their pictures from Facebook and compare it to a sketch from a sketch artist who is going off the best information they have from a witness after the fact. And we see this not just in the Delphi case. We see this in all these other types of cases where people say, oh, sounds like someone I knew. Here's all of their information. They dox them online. They put all this information about someone, and they may not even have anything to do with the case. But it's these internet sleuths that put real people's names, real people's pictures, and link them to a case without any information other than pure speculation. We, of course, saw this in the Idaho case, where before there was an arrest made, there were people online speaking out real people's names that we will not repeat here, and saying that they were the murderers, that they were the ones responsible for a quadruple brutal murder of 4 college students. Of course, that turned out to be absolute baloney, but those have led to real charges against people. They have real implications on people's lives, people's professions, and also on the victims themselves. The victims' families, of course, want justice. And when they are hearing all these quote unquote experts on the internet who claim to have more information than the families are allowed, because the police have to keep certain things close to the vest, especially in an active investigation, so that they don't tip off the suspect and so that they'll run and not be able to actually make an arrest in the case, the family members may be seeking more information, and they look online to these voices that seem to have authority, and they may get the wrong information, which is just insult to injury when it ends up being false and they're having to relitigate the greatest tragedy of their lives.
And I think, going back to Delphi for a second, just remember all of those people who were subjected to that kind of speculation. Some of them about are more famous, the sheriff, for instance, members of the family. There were people who said that Kelsey was somehow involved, that she was suspicious. Whether you think it was Odinist or you think it was Richard Allen, there's one thing we know for sure at this point, or I feel pretty confident about, is that none of those people who were subjected to that, who have now living forever online YouTube videos and podcasts and everything else, none of those people had anything to do with this. Every single one of them was falsely accused. They were all absolutely innocent. In the case of Kelsey, not only were they innocent, but imagine how painful that would have been to have been accused of being involved in your own sister's murder. And the fact that that happens is truly a dark side to true crime, which we all love. The reason we're involved in this is because we love this genre. We like listening to these cases, and we want to reach some sort of resolution. We want justice for victims. We want people who disappeared to be found. We want people who are murdered to have their day in court. We want all of those things. But somehow along the path, we end up with these just horrible things happening. Alice mentioned Idaho. I don't know how many of you have followed what all happened. There's I think a Netflix documentary on some of the stuff that happened in Idaho before Brian Koberger was arrested. But one of the most just egregious and insane things that happened was there was a TikToker with, 100,000 followers, I think more than that, who decided that she had had a psychic vision. And in fact, it was a professor at the university that had murdered these kids. She saw this in a vision, and she puts this out, multiple videos viewed hundreds of thousands of times. That professor has sued this person for defamation. It's an ongoing fight. And to this day, they're still fighting about this. This was actually mentioned, talked about the Clue Awards at CrimeCon. This was mentioned by Ashley Banfield in her opening remarks about true crime. She talked about this very thing that happened to this professor. And when you think about, there's no way, and we don't want to, right? Like, we don't want gatekeepers who are silencing people. And now I'll say this, when you start slandering people, we've gone beyond free speech because it's slander. But nevertheless, we don't really want that, because gatekeepers, censors, they're always bad. They always go too far. And really, the people that this falls to is all of us, true crime creators and true crime consumers. When you hear things and you see things like that, you have to be prepared to, even if you enjoy that person's content, you have to be prepared to sort of vote with your feet, as it were, and take away your time and your attention, because that is the thing that these folks want more than anything. It's what we want. We want you guys to listen to us. We want more listeners. We've been incredibly blessed, but we also want you to hold us accountable. And if we are doing things that we should not be doing, that are hurting real innocent people, we want to hear about it from you. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to take that step.
And I'll go one additional step there. There are real implications to this sort of irresponsible true criming, shall I say, because of what's happening to real people who are being accused, whose names, they never put themselves as public figures, and all of a sudden their names and addresses and private information is splashed all over the internet because someone has a vision or just simply thinks they look like a sketch that the police have released. But here's another thing. Having prosecuted cases and run investigations, that I can tell you, and we have seen this time and time again, the immense amount of irresponsible pressure on investigations and police forces as they are honing in on their investigation can absolutely hamper an investigation and hamper a prosecution. We've already talked about the obvious ways that a prosecution can be hampered. If witnesses are being intimidated, if they're being doxxed online, guess what? People don't want to go to the police with tips. People don't want to testify in court. They may even minimize what they actually know so that they don't have a centerpiece play within a story. They may know much more, but they're like, you know what? You guys are really mean about Alice Scott and that whole Leo Schofield thing. What if I'm an Alice Scott and I didn't know that? Why don't I just say I didn't see anything? I don't know. I really did see something, but I'm just not going to say anything. And you know what? If I say I saw something and it doesn't really go along with what mainstream media thinks happened, like I think I saw something that totally cuts against a conspiracy by the law enforcement, they're going to hate me. And then they're going to come and try to torch my house, quite literally. They're going to know where my kids go to school. So you know what? Let me just float in the background. It's not my case. I didn't murder anybody. Let me just not say anything. We see this with real witnesses. We see this in our own cases, and it's because of the unfair pressures that are being put on the prosecution side. Let's move to the investigation. Murders and kind of the most heinous violent crimes are almost always going to be state and local investigations because those are typically state and local laws. Feds only typically come in to assist, but it's usually not a federal investigation unless there's a federal hook. So if you murdered someone while taking them across state lines, potentially that could be a federal case. But the vast majority of the violent crimes that we talk about are state and local cases. They typically are run by law enforcement agencies that may not see a lot of this. So sure, if you're investigating a heinous murder in Los Angeles or Manhattan, yeah, those police forces have done this a lot. They have a lot of expertise. But guess what? People get murdered everywhere. Violent crimes happen everywhere. And by the grace of God, a lot of these small towns haven't seen many violent crimes before. That's good. But what it also means is that all of a sudden, when small town in middle America becomes national, international news, and everything they do is being scrutinized by every single armchair detective on Reddit, they are human beings and they have never had the spotlight shown on them, and they know how to do their job, typically. But when everything they do is being flashed across CNN as a headline, and everyone has an opinion as to what they are doing right or wrong when they have imperfect information, because investigations, much of it has to be private, law enforcement officers can change their paths because they're trying to avoid missteps. And those changes in the way they would normally run an investigation could mean it completely hampers an investigation. Or you have internet sleuths who go find out information that the public shouldn't have. And what do? They publish it on YouTube. They publish it on Reddit. And you know why it's not public information? Because that information needed to be private for purposes of the investigation not being compromised. These are very serious implications that will have on real investigations and real prosecutions. This is not hypothetical. We are seeing this today. We've seen it happen in the past. And this is why the ethic of true crime lies not just with the content creators, but with the consumers as well.
And as we said earlier, I think one of the problems is people trying to make everything so black and white. And I hope one thing you're getting from this is not black and white. It's really hard, actually, because you want, in a free society, the press, journalists, have a role to play in ensuring that rights are upheld. And journalist doesn't just mean somebody who graduated from journalism school, and it doesn't just mean somebody who works for a newspaper. You know, people, I hear this sometimes. I talked about the person in the Karen Reed case who has those felony charges, and people want to say, oh, he's just a blogger. He's not even a journalist. Well, actually, no. I mean, he is a journalist. He is a journalist. He's gone way too far, and he's definitely crossed the line in many ways. But he is a journalist, and you want that light shone on what is happening because you want things to happen in light. But I think one thing, and why this is hard, is it's also important to remember that we really shouldn't matter all that much. If things are working the way they're supposed to, we just talk on a podcast, or we just write in a newspaper, or we just blog, or we just appear on YouTube. I mean, we're not storming the beaches of Normandy here. You know, some people act like they want to act like their podcast is the most important thing in the world. And it's not. The system, the justice system, is supposed to be where people are adjudicated guilty or innocent, not in newspapers, not on blogs, not on podcasts. It's not supposed to be based on how many people you can get outside the courthouse, or how big your bullhorn is, or how loud you are, or how many people sign your change.org petition. It's supposed to be based on evidence that comes in to court before a jury through the rules of evidence in front of a judge, presented by a prosecutor and defended by a defense attorney. And those people need to be the ones who are litigating these cases. And I don't have as much of a problem with them as I do with some of the stuff that happens outside that courtroom. Just go back to the Karen Reed case. A lot of people don't like the defense attorneys. Now, some reasons they don't like them is because they think they are working with the press to stir all this up. But put that aside for a second. The things they're doing in the courtroom, I get it. If you think Karen Reed's guilty, you think that they're basically slandering innocent people. I totally understand your position on that, but that's your position on it. Their job is to highlight inconsistencies and doubt and everything else that happens in this case to ensure that if Karen Reed is convicted, it's because she's guilty. That's their job. They are the defense attorneys. They're the ones who should be doing that. But when it's people outside who are trying to influence the jury on their behalf, who are trying to intimidate witnesses on their behalf, who are trying to reach justice through these outside judicial means, that is not a good thing. That is a negative. Unless you can show me that the courts aren't functioning, which they obviously are in this case, then what you're doing is mob rule. Now, it may be mob justice, so you think, for somebody who's innocent, but it's still mob justice. And mob justice is not a good thing. That is not what we want happening, because I will tell you, even if it works out for you this time, it's not going to work out for you in the vast majority of times.
I hope you all heard that. That is incredibly important. Mob rule is going to turn against you. That's what we know about mob rule. Maybe you like what mob rule is doing in one particular case, but absolutely not. The reason due process exists is because, I was speaking to a room full of 400 high school girls at Girls State earlier this week. And one of them asked, what I don't like our political system in that it works so slowly. The justice system seems to get things wrong sometimes, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, okay, that is all right. But here is the thing. We live in a country in the United States where even if 10,000 people witnessed you firsthand, so we're not talking about circumstantial evidence, we're talking about direct evidence, see you commit the crime. It's on security footage. Your DNA is all over it, and you confess to it on the spot. Guess what? You don't get to be thrown in prison for the rest of your life. You still are entitled to due process. Even if all those things happen, you still have to be charged, adjudicated. Those things could go quickly if you've already confessed, but there's still a process. We don't get to just go out there and born identity snatch people off the streets and say, I know you did this. You've even confessed. You go to prison now. There's actually a process, especially for those who are accused of a crime. And when you take all that away, you are taking away all of the protections, not of the innocent, but actually of the guilty. And that is not a world in which you want to live, because our justice system was put in place to actually protect those who all the evidence could be stacked against them, and it doesn't matter. We don't get to go to the grand jury as prosecutors and say, we get to bypass. There's no bypassing of the justice system because our evidence reaches a certain threshold. It's not like probable cause gets you an indictment, reasonable doubt gets you a conviction, and overwhelming evidence means we get to go to your house, grab you out of your bed, and stick you straight into jail. That's not the justice system we have, but that's what mob rule is. So think about that really, really hard when you are either taking part in this extrajudicial mob rule style. And that may sound extreme, like this isn't mob rule. Absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. Let's call it what it is first. When you're trying to go through extrajudicial means in order to change the outcome of what is happening within the justice system. You may not like a particular judge. That judge actually doesn't sit alone. There's an entire appellate process that goes along with it. And there are attorneys who respect that. And there are also attorneys who recognize that our current social media connected world is very prone to want to do extrajudicial means. And so this is an interesting balance when you have lawyers taking part in extrajudicial means of influencing public opinion to affect what's happening in court.
And I think another thing that's important to remember is when you're listening to these people, they all have an opinion. They all have a position they're coming from. So I hate to keep going back to Karen Read, but it's in the news right now. So Karen Read's defense attorneys will tell you that no one wants justice more for John O'Keefe than them. They will say things like that, right? And their point is, and that's why we want to get our client off, because she didn't do it. And if he's going to find justice, the only way is if we win. That is a great rhetorical point, and I'm sure there is some truth to it, but not a lot. Because frankly, even if they knew for a fact that she was absolutely guilty, it would be their job to go in there and get her off. Even if it means that John O'Keefe is never going to have justice, it is their job to go in there and win that case and get her acquitted. Prosecutors, I would like to say we always wear the white hat. I think to some extent we do. I want people like Richard Allen to have his constitutional rights upheld, but that's because I care about the Constitution, not Richard Allen, right? I want Richard Allen to be convicted because I think he's guilty. I want it to be done in a way that won't be overturned later on. But for me to act like I am as equally concerned about Richard Allen as I am the family and the girls is just not true. And I think it's important when people are talking to you about these things that you remember the perspective they're coming from, because it colors everything they say.
And despite for the last 20 minutes going on a rant about true crime and whatnot, don't read this to say that media doesn't have a good role to play as well. We've had the good fortune of working with really good content creators who want to tell a story. And I've said this before, and I really mean it. If I'm accused of a crime wrongfully, or rightfully, to be totally honest, I would absolutely want someone to make a documentary about it or make a podcast about it to tell my story. So if you have a loved one out there, absolutely, you want that story covered by the media. But there is a responsible way, and that's why we're having this discussion of how to do it. A great example of this, of course, is Gilbert King, who made the Bone Valley podcast about Leo Schofield. We also covered the case, and we ended up agreeing with his same outcome, thinking that Leo was not only wrongfully convicted, we actually think he would have been convicted with what was in evidence at the time of his trial, but that he is an innocent man today. With that said, the way you listen to Bone Valley, even though from the very first episode, you know where he's going to come out. The very first episode is Gilbert King saying, I started covering this case because someone told me it was an innocent man in jail. So that's going to be the thesis of the entire podcast. We know it. He doesn't hide the ball. So we know it's an advocacy piece, but he does it in a way where he presents both sides. There are some really unflattering things about Leo in his podcast. You know what he's trying to do, which is to advocate for what he believes is true, that Leo did not murder his wife. But he doesn't do it in a way that gaslights or leaves out important bits of information that gives you a one-sided story so that all of a sudden you think the entire justice system was on fire and they were out to get Leo and that there can never be justice again, right? It's a very complex issue. And the reason it's important to delve into the complexities of this is we don't want innocent people in jail. We do want functioning judicial systems because look, if we don't have a functioning judicial system, it's not good for any of us, right? We need something to take its place. So what would it be? So you can't simply just tear it all down. You have to know what you're working with, and there's something is going to fill that vacuum if you truly want to tear down the judicial system. And if you tear it down with nothing to replace it, it will be mob rule. And so I would argue that you either need to see what is happening in specific cases where the justice system did not work out for whatever reason and analyze it, understand what led to that outcome to be able to fix it for future cases as well.
And I think this is so important because it matters for people like Leo who are in prison unjustly. I mean, he's not anymore. Thank goodness he was paroled. But when I first saw Bone Valley, my initial thought was this is going to be another podcast, documentary, innocence thing about somebody who is guilty. They're going to leave out a whole bunch of stuff. They're going to spin a whole bunch of stuff. They're going to tell an emotional story. And it's going to turn out at the end of the day, the guy's guilty. And in order to get over that bias, I had to read the entire trial transcript and read like every piece of paper and everything else in that case. And that's a bad place to be. It's a bad place to be when you become so jaded that every time you see a claim of innocence, you just assume the person's guilty. And I'll give you an example. I was just trying to research this earlier. There's some guy in Missouri, I forget his name. He's set for execution sometime in September. The Innocence Project had his case. They say he's been exonerated on the basis of DNA. And I'm just like, has he? And I keep reading these stories about it, and nobody will tell me what the DNA was or how it's exonerated him. The only reason I even take it seriously is because Maggie Freeling says he's innocent. And Maggie Freeling is another person who I respect so much. You guys who listen to Murder and Alliance. Maggie went into Murder and Alliance thinking that the person she was advocating for was innocent. And through the course of that podcast, one of the most amazing podcasts you'll ever hear, she learned more and more that led her to the conclusion that, in fact, the person that she was advocating for was guilty. And there's an amazing moment in the podcast where it all comes together, and it affects her so deeply. And she's so broken by it because she feels so passionate about this. But she didn't hide it. She didn't cut that part out. She didn't ignore the evidence she saw. She reported on it, and she reported on it honestly. And it's one reason that when Maggie tells me somebody's innocent, even if I disagree with her, I take her seriously. But you can't trust what you see now because it's all become so industrialized almost. There's like an industrial true crime complex out there that's feeding you this narrative, and it's so hard to know whether or not it's true. And that's really sad. It's really sad that people can't trust anybody anymore. I mean, we always say, don't even trust us. Go read the stuff, because we don't want to tell you to trust us to the exclusion of everybody else. We can't say that to you. I mean, I think it's true that you could, but you really do at this point have to go to the sources. And that's really hard. And you would like to believe that you could trust the sources out there to report to you honestly on the facts so that you could reach some sort of conclusion. And that's something we've lost because of some of the stuff we've talked about. And we've talked a lot about the problems and a little bit about the solutions. And one thing I would say to people that I think you can do that at least will help you navigate some of this, we have this like open mind thing right now. Like we're radically open-minded. We have this notion that we should be open-minded about everything. And that's not really how you live your life. If you woke up tonight and there was smoke in your house, you probably would go on the assumption that there's a fire. Not that somebody decided to cook a meal at 2:00 in the morning and it just got smoky, right? Because you're not radically open-minded about why there's smoke. But when it comes to true crime cases, for instance, it's as if when people in Delphi tell you it was Odinist, well, we got to be open-minded about this. We got to look at all the evidence. And you should look at all the evidence, but the position you start from should not be one of equipoise. It shouldn't be, well, I'm going to be open-minded about this. If someone is making an extraordinary claim of you, demand extraordinary evidence. Make them prove it to you. Make them show you the evidence. Make them get up and go into the kitchen, and there's your husband cooking a steak at 2:00 in the morning, making the place smoky. That's evidence, right? Demand that from the people who are telling you that extraordinary things are happening, whether it's a conspiracy or whether it's just something that seems straight out of a Hollywood movie. Make them prove it.
That was beautiful, Brett. I don't know that I want to say more than that. And I think that's exactly right. We've said this literally from our very first episode when we were a bunch of podcast babies and we made our top 10 rules. We said, go to the evidence, go to the sources, and read for yourself. Court opinions are online for the most part. Supreme Court opinions certainly are online. And trials, for the most part, they should all be open, but obviously the really famous cases, you have to wait outside in line and whatnot. But your local courthouses are all open. You can sit in those courthouses. You can observe how judges work. If you have an election for judges in your city, you can go observe what that judge does. You can observe how far behind they are on their cases. You can observe how they rule on cases based on public dockets, and you can inform yourself. Don't just rely on what we say. Don't rely on what you hear on YouTube. Don't even rely on broadcast TV, documentaries. We are all given minds to think, and that's all we ask, is that you make use of it, because we meet these incredibly intelligent, compassionate people. And somehow in the true crime space, especially in very heated cases that get a lot of media attention, it's amazing how many people will either suspend their own analytical abilities or just listen to their favorite content creator for all of their information. This is just a reminder that you have the ability to push back, ask questions, and not take as true gospel everything that you hear from content creators. This, again, includes us. So thanks for listening to our soapbox. But I do think this is incredibly important because it's something that obviously is on our minds. It was something we hear about and talk about a lot, especially coming off of CrimeCon. And it's also going to be important moving forward because we have just finished or we're in the midst of a bunch of trials that are high profile. There are many high profile cases coming up. And guess what? They're not going to go away, right? This is not a new problem. It has only been highlighted more and more because of the rise of the ease in which to produce content and put it out in the world with very little filter. Anyone can have a YouTube page now. Really, anyone can have a podcast. And there are very, very few filters now that used to exist, which is both good and bad. It's wonderful that there are more voices out there, but more voices also means that you need to be a bit more discerning about what you consume and what you promote.
Yeah, and we don't have all the answers. Frankly, we don't have many of the answers. We're part of the problem in some way because true crime is a behemoth. And we're part of that behemoth, and that behemoth needs to be fed, and it needs content. And the most popular content tends to be the most outrageous, and that's just the way it is. And we're only going to see more and more of this because you got to feed that beast. But I think all of us can try and tame the beast to some extent, and we have a responsibility to do that, and we want you guys, as we said, to hold us accountable. And we don't want this to be us talking at you. We want this to be a conversation. I hope it's a conversation that'll continue on Twitter or whatever we call it now. I guess it's officially X now. They got the X.com thing, but Facebook, the gallery, on our Patreon page, wherever, in the YouTube comments, wherever it is that you like to talk about these things. If, heaven forbid, if you hang out on Reddit, wherever you are, talk about these things, work through them, because they're hard questions. They are difficult, tough questions. And how exactly to draw the line and where the line is, it's not easy to find. So we're going to keep struggling to find it. Sometimes we will cross the line as well. And we will do our best when we do that to pull back. But that's all we can promise you, is that we will do the very best we can to try and honor the trust that you guys have put in us, because we respect that so much. And we always try and give you as close as possible both sides of the story, even at the end of the day, if we're going to give you our theory, which is going to land somewhere.
Wonderful. I'm not even going to ask you, Brett, if you have something else to add, because we really could speak about this for a long time. I'm really so thankful that we were able to put it into writing and an op-ed. You guys are welcome to read it if you'd like. But thank you for trusting us and listening to us. And we just ask you to keep us accountable as well, because we want to always be better. We want to make sure that we are giving you information and our opinions, which we freely give all the time, but we'd like to give you our opinions, tell you it's our opinions, but do it in a responsible and ethical manner. And Brett, this has been fun. Are we going to do questions today, or is that enough question and answer for the day?
Well, I'm always saying, let's do a question.
Let's do some questions.
Like we've been so fired up lately at the end. We haven't been doing the questions.
I know. We've been like too angry and been like, all right, until next time, I'm Alice.
Yeah. And I'm always like, oh, shoot. We didn't do any questions. Okay, let's do a question. Let's see. Since we got all serious, we'll need to. And you guys have been really good at the Legal Briefs questions. They have been flying.
They've been like great questions.
And I love them. And I'm glad we have them. Because for a while there, we had like 2 Legal Briefs questions. But now we got a whole bunch. Okay, let me see. Okay, let's see. What's a good one? I'm not even going to ask that because Alice will tell me something crazy.
What?
Okay, fine. I'll ask it.
Uh-oh.
The answer for me is I don't have any, but I don't know if you have any secrets left, Alice, but I'll... Haley Dawn wants to know, what secret skill or talent do each of you possess.
You have so many talents. They just might not be secret.
I really don't. I mean, I guess a lot of people didn't know I wrote books because I sold a bunch of them at CrimeCon. So I do write horror novels. I used to. I haven't been able to write one in a really long time. I'll be honest with you. I would like to write more, but where's the time? Where am I going to find that time? So
if you haven't read what Brett's written, and I'm not a horror novel fan, but Brett is clearly like one of the best writers I've ever read. I would read anything you write. So maybe you need to get back in the game. Maybe not horror though, for my sake.
Well, you've got to tell us your. Do you have any secret talents left? You're a dancer. You're an
I don't have any talents.
Fiddler,
these stories just come popping out.
You're a skydiver. You dive through the air and through the sea.
Okay, this is not a secret at all, but maybe it will inspire someone who has imposter syndrome. Okay, so I think some of y'all have heard before that I was on the varsity equestrian team in college. What you may not know, though, is that I had zero experience riding horses before I tried out for the varsity equestrian team in college. And talk about like serious imposter syndrome. So I had danced my entire life, and
Can I just say, this story she's about to tell y'all is just absurd. This is so purely Alice, but continue, please continue.
I think this applies to everyone out there. This is to all of the young ladies and men out there who are ever thinking, I can't do that, I'm not qualified, etc., etc. This is my story, not to be like, oh, I'm so great, but to say you can do it. Okay, so this is your pump up talk for the day. So I danced my entire life. I loved dance, but I also recognized that I should probably not be a dancer. I wasn't that talented, that to make it a profession where I could support myself financially. So I picked a college that I ended up loved the college, but there was no dance program at all. So there was dance wasn't even an option, and it was a small town of 8,000 people. So there was no dance in the community. So I kind of intentionally chose a place where I couldn't even do the thing that I loved. So I get to college. I'm like, what am I going to do now? I used to dance 25 hours a week and did shows 8 times a week. And now I have nothing to do. I never played sports because I was too busy dancing. So I had no other physical talent. And it just happened that a girl who lived on my freshman dorm hall was leaving to go to the barn. She had on her breeches and, the whole get up. And I was like, she looks pretty cool. And I just said hi. And I was like, where are you going? She goes, oh, I'm going to go, work out my horse because the equestrian team tryouts are coming up at the end of the week. And I was like, that's cool. To be a horse rider. She's like, you're weird. And she goes, do you want to come? And I was like, what? And she goes, well, actually, the way collegiate varsity equestrian works is that there's 5 categories, and the lowest 2 categories are really hard to fill because you have to have basically be good enough to ride horses, but never have competed to not rack up enough points to point yourself out of those categories because they're looking for people who haven't been riding horses all over the world and competing with these $1 million horses. But most people who've spent that much time riding horses have competed and cannot qualify for those levels. And she's like, you said you danced. Those are a lot of the same muscles. Do you want to come to the barn with me? I'll give you a couple pointers on my horse and you can see if you want to try out. And I was like, why not? I have no friends. I don't know anybody here. I have nothing else to do. So yes, I followed her to the barn, and she had this beautiful horse that was $1 million. And she lent me a helmet and she boosted me up onto the horse. And I've been on a horse once before, on a pony ride, right? When I was 8. And she gave me some pointers and she was like, you kind of have a talent for this because you have the right muscles. It's a lot of inner thigh ab muscles. Do you want to work together this week? Because she has an interest. It's a team sport, right? You want really good people on all the levels. She's going to clearly be in the highest level if she makes the team. And she's like, do you want to work on my horse this week? And then we'll try out together at the end of the week. And she came to the school to be on the equestrian team. And I was like, yeah, of course. So I went out to the barn for 5 days in a row. She taught me on her beautiful horse, and I tried out and I made it, and then I won regionals that year, and I rode for 4 years on the varsity team, but I'd never been really on a horse.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, she won regionals that year after having never been on a horse. You can do it too. You can do it too. But it was such an awesome experience throughout college. I mean, my coaches, my teammates, learning a new skill. I hadn't really learned a new skill my whole, because I danced so long.
that it was incredibly humbling, incredibly humbling. And I would have lost out on like a massive part of my college and life experience if I just said no and just like stayed home. So don't say no. Go out and do it.
So when I started college, I have a similar story. So when I started college, I wanted to do something athletic that I had never done before. And I found out that the University of Alabama has a rowing team, like a crew team, and they had open tryouts. So I sent an email. I was like, hey, I want to do this. And they were like, great. Meet us down at the river at 4:30. And I was like, 4:30 in the afternoon? And they're like, no, 4:30 in the morning. And I was like, thanks for the opportunity, but I think I'm going to pass. So that's my story. That's
4:30 is rough, though.
Similar story.
Look, I got to go to the barn during daylight hours, so maybe say no when it's 4:30 in the morning.
Yes, there you go. All right. Well, I think that was sufficient, Alice.
That was sufficient. Sorry, guys.
Of course. I knew.
Well, guys, it has been awesome spending time with you today. Brett, it's great to record with you again. It was very fun being on Podcast Row with you, but it's good to be back in our respective closets recording.
Amen.
And until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
Don't forget to watch 2020 tomorrow.
I don't know if I want to.
I don't know. I don't want to watch it either.
So Mr. Alice was like, do you want to have a party? And I was like, heck no. I was like, that's the last thing I want to do.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. He did ask if I wanted to go over to y'all's house and watch it together. And I was like, you're the only person I would watch it with, but I was like, it's when our kids are going crazy, so I don't think so.
I almost just want to let other people watch it and tell us, number one, how often are we in it? And number two, how terrible is it?